This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Hello everyone, let's get started. I hope you had a good time over the Easter break. So far we went through some ideas about infrastructure. Infrastructure is very closely related to the population size. I have invited David Sykes. He is working in the Department of Victoria. His department produces the Victorian Future, which is about population changes in Victoria. So I believe this lecture will give you a very good idea about how population has been changed over time and where people are spread out in Victoria, and this will give you a good ideas the demand for infrastructure and desire for the infrastructure due to the growing population. Let's warm welcome David Sykes.
Thank you, Min. Good morning, everyone. Everyone can hear me? Yeah? All good? Cool, thank you. My name's Dave. I'm here from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Min mentioned infrastructure, and Mitchell and my colleague and I just about made it here on time thanks to all the infrastructure upgrades that are going on. And the other piece of essential infrastructure I have this morning are my tissues. So I've had an attack of hay fever, so forgive me if I start sneezing halfway through this, but I'll try and get through. We work in a small research area called the Land Use and Population Research Team. We have a range of experts that work on demography, employment analysis, environmental analysis, housing research, tracking the development that goes on throughout Melbourne and throughout Victoria. And we try to use all our information to give planners, service providers, infrastructure builders a view of the future, of what's coming, what the servicing task is. What I'm going to talk about today is first, I'm going to talk about, as it says up there, demography matters. Everyone has a demographic story. We're all part of the population. I'm going to talk about the importance of the basics, learning a few ways to understand and analyse the population, to look at what's there now, try and work out what's happening in the future. Talk quickly about some of the population challenges that we have as planners and people who need to think about providing services and infrastructure for the future. A few thoughts about how to plan for the future, how to estimate what might happen in the future, some hints and tips about what you should be bearing in mind when you're thinking about these things. So first, demography matters, and it does. Population's in the news quite a lot of late. There's stories about, quite a lot of stories linking directly to infrastructure, saying that our city is groaning, our city is struggling to cope with our rapid population growth. And the growth is very rapid. I'll show some images and put up some numbers about just how rapid it is at the moment. And of course, Melbourne has the tag of the world's most livable city, which is, it's disputable, of course. Plenty of places could say they're livable, but Melbourne does all right. And it's, again, our task as planners, of those who are custodians of the future, to ensure that we remain as livable as possible. But it is, as another headline says here, a very, very big challenge. When the task that you have in front of you is increasing at a rapid rate, you need to think about perhaps new ways of looking at things. So why we do what we do as state government planners is grounded in the Planning and Environment Act, 1987, because we're required to provide for the fair and orderly and economic and sustainable use and development of land. And if we want to do that, we need to think about the present and the future. And in particular, there's a couple of other highlighted passages. If you look at the very bottom line, it's to balance the present and future interests of all Victorians. If we want to think about what we must do for the future, sometimes we need to balance that against the needs of the present. It would have been a lot more convenient for Mitchell and I getting here if our travel hadn't been disrupted by the building of the new Metro Tunnel. But we need to do that in order to provide for the future. So it's about making those balances, those trade-offs those choices between what do we do now and how can we provide for the future. And I'm assuming the readings are still roughly the same as last year, Min, because this is last year's slide, but there's plenty of planning literature that will also tell you that thinking about the future, and in particular forecasting the future population, which is a specialty of my team, that's myself and Mitchell and Beatrice, who are also sitting over here. This is our specialty, is looking at the past and the present population using whatever information we can to get an idea of what it's going to be like in the future. So, when I talk about demography, the basic definition is the study of the size, how many people, the distribution, where are those people, and the composition of the population. The composition largely for us is about what are the ages of the population now and in the future, what are the types of households that people arrange themselves into. Any group of 1,000 people could be arranged into 1,000 households if they were all living as one-person households, or they could be arranged into 250 four-person households, or any number of combinations. And that's important because it's households that consume some services, such as dwellings. If it was 1,000 one-person households, you need 1,000 dwellings. If they're four-person households, you need 250 dwellings, and they're dwellings of different types. And of course, if we're talking about the future, then what's important is the change over time in all these aspects of the population. How many people were there in the past? How many in the future? Are there changes in distribution? Are people living in different places for different reasons? And you've probably heard about the ageing of the population. We are going to be, on average, an older population, but that doesn't mean there aren't lots of young people to provide for as well. Getting back to real basics though, what is the population? To take a real straight dictionary definition, it's the number of people inhabiting a specific area. The population of this room right now, I counted about 50, but probably a couple of people have come in since I stopped counting. That could be the population of this room. At the end of this lecture, the population of this room will be different when people leave. So what area are we thinking about when we talk about the population? We're talking about the population of the whole of Australia. If we're trying to plan railway services in Melbourne, knowing how the population of the whole of Australia is changing isn't as much use to us. We need to know about what's happening in the local areas. At what time? Are we thinking about the population purely now? Are we thinking about the population in the future? For how long are we expecting people to be in a particular place? Are we thinking about a variable population, like this lecture theatre, that changes from time to time? Or are we thinking about what's likely to be the average? If you wanted to know, how large to build a lecture theatre, you might want to know the average class size, or the largest possible class size, rather than just the one that's here now. And for what purpose are people here? Are we talking about a population of people who live in a place, the population of people who work there, the population of people who study there? They all come up with different answers, different reasons for why we might want to know what that number is. And we could be thinking about the status of people. Are we thinking about the population, thinking about the university? Are we thinking about people who are officially students here, or everyone who might be visiting here? So if we're thinking about Australia, do we just want to count the Australian citizens? That doesn't do us much good, because there's a lot of people who are in Australia long-term and permanently who aren't Australian citizens. So if we want to know the most useful number, it's not always the most logical number at times. So it comes down to that last question. Why do you need to know? What are you trying to work out? Think about which population is most appropriate for your particular question or your area of study. I bet a bunch of people here filled out a census form a couple of years ago. Everyone did? Yeah? Yes? Show of hands. Everyone filled out their census form. Everyone had a fantastic time. Nothing went wrong. Nothing at all. It was perfect. When you did that census form, there were two different things that you filled in on your form. One was where you actually were on census night, and one was where you usually live. For a lot of people, it might have been the same thing if you filled it out at home. But that census night happens in August, and if you look at, say, the ski fields in the mountains in Victoria, there's a lot more people there in August than usually live there. So there are two different populations we get out of the census. The one, the enumerated population, is where were people counted on census night, and that can be useful for some reasons, but also there's the usual residents. Where do people usually live? And if you want to look at providing sort of services that last through the whole year, Maybe you need to look at the usual residents. If you want to provide for that peak population in the ski fields, then August would be a good time to measure it. And as I said, there are variable populations by season, and then there's variable populations by time of day. If you want to know, again, say you want to set up a cafe in the city of Melbourne, you want to know how many people are your market. If you look at the usual resident population, that's going to be the number of people who sleep here overnight. But if you want to know the number of people who might be your customers, that could be the number of people who are here at midday or 4 p.m, which is very, very different, because a lot of people come into the city of Melbourne during the day and then they leave again at night. So some suburbs empty out during the day as people go other places for work, and then they fill up again when people come home at night. Outer suburbs often have their peak population at 2 or 3 a.m, when just about everyone is at home and asleep. But most of the population numbers I'll talk about today use the estimated resident population. That's the official population that's published by the Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, and it's pretty closely based on the census, but it's an estimate for 30th of June each year. So it coincides with end of financial year. In some cases you'll get things updated quarterly, but we tend to measure year by year, and we look at the 30th of June each year. Now the census was conducted on the 9th of August, so there's already a bit of a difference because the population will have changed between the 30th of June and the 9th of August. But there are also some other factors to adjust, like people who were overseas when the census was were on census night and didn't get to fill out a census form. So allowance is made for all these little adjustments to provide the population at 30th of June in a census year. So the 30th of June 2011, the 30th of June 2016 are very good estimates of the population. But the census is only every 5th year, and we don't have a census in between. It'd be great for us if we did it, if you guys had to fill out a census every 6 months, say. That'd work really well for us because we'd have up-to-date information, except you'd probably get sick of it, and maybe the information wouldn't get so good in the end. But when you're filling it out every 5th year, there are years in between where we don't know what's happening with the population due to a census. So the ways we could look at that, we could think about the basic demographic equation, we could think about the components of population change, we could think about demographic accounting. They're probably all reasonably new terms to you, and the good news is that they're all the same thing. So the answer is all of the above. If we want to know, the census is like a stock take. In a shop, a store, you do a stock take once a year and you work out just exactly what you've got on the shelves. But during the year, you can track what's happening because you know pretty well how much you've sold, how much has been delivered, what's come in and out. And it's a bit the same with the basic demographic equation, which is a bit more basic than that, really. If you want to make it complex, you can look at that. But if you want to make it simple, you can use a flow chart, and conceptually, it's really, really simple. The population changes from time to time in really only 4 ways. There are 2 ways that you can add to the population, which is people being born or people migrating in, people moving in from elsewhere. If it's the population of a town, people moving in from another town. If it's the population of Australia, it has to be people moving in from overseas. Then there's only 2 ways people can leave the population. They can either die or they can move out. So the person that moved to Australia from somewhere else migrates out from one population and into our population. And the Bureau of Statistics tracks these things every year, or every quarter. So we get a reasonably good idea in between censuses of what the population is by looking at how many births have been registered, how many deaths have been registered, how many new migrants there are to Australia, and how many people have left Australia. That gets trickier when you get down to smaller areas because it's harder to count how many people have left Boroondara than it is to count how many people have left Australia. But when all that accounting is done, we end up with figures for the population change every year for Victoria. In fact, every quarter. This has been updated now. It takes a little while to process the information, but the latest information is for the 30th of September last year, when the population of Victoria was about 6.359 million, roughly, getting on for 6.5 million, and the annual growth was 147,400, which is very, very strong growth. There's only been a few years in Victoria's history when the population has grown by more than 100,000. Growing by 147,000, that's a Ballarat and a half, a Bendigo and a half, nearly half, or a bit under half a Canberra, that we're adding to Victoria every year. One of the most popular sort of figures or images that gets bandied about is that we're adding an MCG a year or something to the population, but we've gone well beyond that. We couldn't fit 147,400 people into the MCG. And when you think about the MCG, even when you think of it crammed full with 105, 110,000 people, that's showing us only the people. It's not showing us the infrastructure, the services, the houses that are needed to accommodate an extra 150,000 people a year. So it really is a major challenge that we're increasing our population at 2.5% a year, or adding that Bendigo and a half to the population of Victoria every year. I mentioned the demographic accounting, the components of population change. You can see those laid out in the bottom half of the slide. Nearly 90,000 people in net terms came to Victoria from overseas over 1 year. Now that's the net term, so it's about 170,000 people moving in. Beatrice, am I getting it the right way around? It's about 170,000 in, about 80,000 out, gives you about 90,000 net. Interstate migration is also very strong in historical terms. There were times when we lost population to other states in net terms, particularly during the recession of the 1990s, where there were relatively no jobs in Victoria, but better prospects elsewhere. People moved north, New South Wales, Queensland. But right now we're gaining from other states. And we're also having a lot more kids than people moving out of the population at the other end. And that number's also increased of late. 20 years ago, we were only having about 60,000 kids in the population each year. Now it's about 80,000. And about 4 or 5 years after those kids are born, they move into the school system. So if you think that the school system was trying to cope with 60,000 new preps at the turn of the century, now they're trying to cope with 80,000 new preps. So it's a big change in a reasonably short time. Looking at a slightly longer time scale, and for some reason it's not displaying that 185 on the left is actually about an 1851, 1855 maybe. We can see that there are peaks and troughs in the change in the population. This chart isn't showing the total population. It's not that the population itself has gone up and down like that. That's how much growth or decrease in the population we've seen year to year. So there are spikes in the 1850s, which was a gold rush in Victoria. The population of Melbourne went from 30,000 to 100,000 in 1 year, when people flocked from other states and from overseas for gold. In the 1880s, we had economic booms. And when you lay out all the sort of reasons, the stories on top of that chart, you can see that there are good reasons why the population might have increased during a gold rush, decreased when we had an economic bust. The 1916 picture is interesting because in World War I, soldiers going overseas were treated as migrating out. In World War II, they were treated differently. So partly it can come down to where do you draw the boundaries? How do you define what's in and what's out? If you change the way you define something, you can get a different answer. But no matter how you define it, you can't really find a way around the fact that the biggest spike on the far right-hand side of the chart is twice the size of any other booms we'd seen throughout Victoria's history. In the major baby boom and migration boom of the 1950s, after the World War II, when Australia was crying out for labour and extra population, we were adding up to 75,000 people a year to Victoria. Now we're adding nearly double that. So it's a very, very big change to a change in the change of the population. So that was talking about the size of the population. When we think about the distribution, we think about, well, I think about, you might now think about now, metropolitan primacy. That's a fancy way of saying everyone lives in Melbourne. A lot of people live in the capital city, and it happens in a lot of Australian states. Queensland is really the exception because it has the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast and a lot more regional distribution. But in most Australian states, you get a majority of the population living in the capital city. It's partly to do with the historical development of the population. Older countries had a more dispersed population because industries were more dispersed, things developed in a more even way. When you develop at the start of the Industrial Revolution, you use the economies of scale that come with those sorts of mechanisation, and you end up with things concentrating into, in general, the one large city in Australia. It's where we have our one major port, it's where most of our government services are concentrated, and where most of our major employers are concentrated. So if you look at any of the regions around the rest of Victoria, while there are significant sized cities there of 100-odd thousand in Ballarat and Bendigo, 200,000 in Geelong, they pale into insignificance at the virtually 5 million of Melbourne. Beyond the distribution of the population, we can think about the composition. I mentioned that one thing that's very important to us when we think about the composition is the age of the population. Now, you can break down the population generally into 5-year age groups is what we think about. You can think about single years of age at times, but often in order to make things a bit simpler, a bit easier to understand, you look at 5-year age groups. And you can lay things out in a table that tells you all the information you need to know about what the population of Victoria was in 2017, but it's not all that easy to read a table like that and quickly get a picture of what's going on in a population. That's why we use a chart called the population pyramid. It's really just 2 bar charts back to back with males on one side and females on the other side. But with an experienced eye, you can look at a population pyramid and pick up a few things very quickly about what's going on in the population. For instance, you can see in this population pyramid the fact that we're having more children now than we were a little while ago, because the bar at the very bottom, the 0 to 4 age bar, is wider than the couple of bars above it. So as we've moved through time, the people who were born 10 to 14 years ago, who are now 10 to 14, they were a smaller cohort, a smaller number than the number of births that's happening now. You can see evidence of our current migration boom. A lot of people coming from overseas for work, for study, for a whole range of reasons, but the people who come from overseas are generally younger than the general population. People who are the movers and shakers, who make the big moves from place to place, are usually in the ages of about 20 to 40, because that's when people are thinking about establishing a career, finding a house, improving their education, whatever it might be. And then you can see a bulge in the Victorian population from about that 20 to 35 to 40 age group. And then the last thing that you can see, well, there's plenty of things you can see, but another thing that you can see at the top is something about the age structure of, the life expectancy of the population. When you look at the very oldest group, the 85 plus people at the top, you can see that there is a larger number on the female side of that chart than on the male side of that chart. And that shows that females in general live longer than males. But we're going to get it back, don't worry. Those expectancy numbers are converging a bit over time. At the moment, there's about 4 years difference between male and female life expectancy. We think that'll come down to about 2 years, say by the middle of this century. That was the Victorian population pyramid, which is roughly similar to the Australian one in the top left-hand corner. But when you look at some other population pyramids from around the world, again, when you know what you're looking at with a population pyramid, things jump out at you. If you look to the bottom left at the population pyramid of Chad, that's a population pyramid of a developing country that doesn't have a life expectancy as long as Australia's. People born in Chad don't have the same prospects as people born in Australia. So there are a lot of kids at the bottom of the population pyramid, and nowhere near as many of them survive into the older ages at the top of the population pyramid. That's sort of as close as you get to it actually looking a bit like a pyramid. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, that's the pyramid for Italy. Now, I mentioned that we have been increasing the number of kids we have in the population year on year. In Italy, they're decreasing the number of children they have in the population year on year, where we on average have about 1.8 children per woman who has children. That's balanced out by some that don't have any children at all. In Italy, it's down to about 1.1, 1.2 children per woman. So they're struggling to maintain that population at the bottom end of the pyramid, and you see the big bulge is from the last time they had a higher birth rate, 30 or 40 years ago. And then in the top right-hand corner, a completely different population pyramid to the others, because the others are about sort of the natural processes. Bahrain is purely about a migration process in that pyramid. There's a big bulge in certain age groups and only on one side of the pyramid. That's about guest workers coming and working in Bahrain. And most of them go home at the end of that sort of guest worker period, when they're 20 to 40 or 50, something like that. After that, they go home. And they're mostly male. So there's a bulge in the population pyramid showing where that population is. And if you look at a small town that has a large prison, you'll see something similar. You'll see a bulge, be it a men's or women's prison. You'll see a bulge in the sort of 20 to 40 or 50-year-olds on one side of the chart, and that bulge doesn't change based on what happens to the rest of the town, because the prisoners tend to move out of the prison as they get older, and they get refreshed with plenty of stupid young blokes who come in and do silly things and refresh the prison population at the younger ages. But even when you break it down within a city like Melbourne, or within Victoria, there's a regional town there, there are different age structures that have different needs. Now you see these pyramids have got two parts to them. The solid colours, seem to be in the background, that's the 2016 population. The transparent or the empty bars on the sides are the projected 2031 population. So if you look at the city of Melbourne, the top left-hand corner, you're looking at a population which is dominated by younger people, particularly at 2016. There's a lot of population there in the ages 20 through to 39. So this is the area that contains the CBD, South Bank, Docklands, places where there are a lot of apartments occupied by young professionals, students, so that population is skewed to the younger ages. Over time, we expect that apartment mix to change a little bit, more people to be able to stay around in the city when they're having kids or when they're getting a bit older. So while in the future it's still dominated by the younger age, it's not quite as extreme. The bottom left-hand side is the city of Melton. That's an outer suburban growth area on the fringe of Melbourne, basically where we're turning paddocks into new housing estates and building lots of family homes. So if you look at the bulges in the population you see there, they're in the child ages and the parent ages, and they continue to be more so in those ages over time. Although some of the initial settlers stay, age in place, some of the kids move out, but a lot more kids and parents move in over time. To the top right-hand corner is the rural city of Ararat, which is just beyond Ballarat in the west of Victoria. Like a lot of rural places, its population is quite old. A lot of the young people move to other places for education, for employment, for bright lights, big city, and you end up with a population that is skewed towards the older population. And in the future, we don't expect that to change much. There's a little bit of growth in the numbers of kids, but there's also a lot of growth in the number of people at the older ages, and in particular, the very oldest ages in the rural city of Ararat. And the bottom right-hand corner is the city of Banyule in the middle suburbs of Melbourne. It has a population pyramid that looks a little bit more like the general pyramid of Melbourne, or perhaps even more of Australia, and that shows diversity. There are some parts of Banyule that have plenty of young people, there are some parts of Banyule that have lots of older people, there are large parts of Banyule that have lots of families. So when you have a more diverse population, you end up with a pyramid that's much more even throughout the age groups, rather than one that's skewed to the old or skewed to the young. And those different areas arrange themselves into different types of households. The basic breakdown that we have here are families with children, be it with one parent or two parents, couples without children, lone person households, or group households. And the image for the group household there is possibly a little bit misleading, because a great number of group households are just a couple of unrelated people living together. Two friends living together, maybe three, but often it's just two people sharing a flat. That's a group household if you're unrelated. If you're not part of a couple, you become a group household. So if you look at the city of Melbourne, only 16% of the households within the city of Melbourne are families with children. The other extreme is the city of Melton, our outer suburban growth area, where well over half of the population are arranged into households of families with children. In the city of Melbourne, 20% of the population are in those group households. So that points to a lot of students, a lot of younger people living together, sharing flats, sharing apartments, whereas in other parts of the city and the state, there are many more people arranged into the other types of households. If we look at the rural city of Ballarat, we see 31% of lone person households, and in the city of Melbourne we see 39% lone person households. They're reasonably similar numbers, but they're there for different reasons. If you look at most of the lone person households in the city of Melbourne, they're younger lone persons. If you look at the lone person households in the rural areas, they're more likely to be older people who were once in family households, then were in couple households, then when one partner dies, they're in one person households. So again, you can see lots of numbers, but the stories behind them are very important. So what challenges does population expansion provide? There's different challenges to the different ways that things change. If we look at the growth of a city like Melbourne, metropolitan growth and expansion, about how we're using more space for our city, we've added nearly 1 million people to Melbourne in the last 10 years. When I say we have, it's not been necessarily a state government intention, a plan. It's not a target that we want the population to grow. It's just that Victoria is an attractive place to be. Melbourne's a good place to be employed, to study, to find a house, and people make rational choices about where they want to be. It's a rational choice to come here from interstate or from overseas because the benefits of being here are seen as better or more than the benefits of being somewhere else. But when a lot of people make those decisions, the city grows and changes. Before the gold rush, we were a small port city linked to sort of our natural resources of wool, farming, things like that. After the gold rush, we went through a period that's known as Marvellous Melbourne, which was when a lot of the classic old buildings that you're seeing around the place were built, when a lot of our railway infrastructure was commenced. We had a lot of money from the gold and from our agriculture. At about this time, Melbourne was the richest city in the world. And we expanded beyond that central core and started to fill in the suburbs that you now know as Collingwood, St Kilda, Paran, places like that. By 1899, we're now a city that's using public transport to a large degree. We've got horse trams, cable trams, starting to see electric trams, and we've got steam trains moving people around a much larger city. By 1927, you can start to see the fingers of the railway corridors as things start to suburbanise out through the city. To the southeast, you can see moving out to the Dandenong line about as far as Oakley. You can see moving out through the east to Box Hill, through the south along the coast through Brighton and Sandringham. You can see things moving out to the west to places like Essendon and Sunshine, and to the north and the northeast. By 1954, you can really start to see those corridors along the rail line start to fill in. And of course, a city that's spreading out this far is proving a much greater challenge in people getting around, getting to work, getting to school, wherever they might need to be, than one that was concentrated in such a small area. By 1971, we're really starting to fill in the areas between the railway corridors. We've gone from a situation in the 1950s where we were just entering the age of automobility and each household probably had one car. We've now got getting towards the stage where each individual is starting to want or need one car. And when we've got that kind of mobility around the city, we can fill in the areas in between those public transport corridors. We don't need to catch that train into the city every day. We can drive across the city or from place to place, and therefore we end up with a city that fills in those gaps and again provides different challenges when you start to think about the roads that are needed if our primary way of getting to work becomes driving instead of walking locally or hopping on that train. And we do need to bring this map up to date, but if you look into the 21st century, then you can see we've moved beyond those rail corridors, between them, satellite cities well outside of them, and then at that point we are starting to create a challenge. We're stretching our city a long way. A lot of the employment is in the inner areas, a lot of the people are in the outer areas, so we present challenges. While we build people places to live on the fringes that provide family housing, that provide great neighbourhoods with new facilities, it's very, very difficult to get as much employment out there as you can get people. Sorry, I forgot to make a heading white. All the other headings are white, this one's red. Must mean this is an important slide. This is a slide that shows how people move about the city in longer-term structural senses. We move about the city day to day, week to week, but we also make moves over time around the city. And if our city, well, if people didn't do this, our city wouldn't be expanding. Over time, people have moved outward. If you grow up in the west of Melbourne and you want more space or a more affordable home, generally the way to go is to move out into the Western Corridor. If you grow up in the north and you want those opportunities, you move out in the Northern Corridor. Same in the south and the east. People tend to move over time where they know where their network is, their social network, their employment network. They stay within those sort of mental maps of what they know of the city. And there's a big divide you can see through the middle there, which is the Yarra River. If you're north of the river, you generally stay north of the river. If you're south, you stay south. Now, there are a whole heap of little moves from place to place. There's people moving from everywhere into the city when they're young. But when they move out generally to have kids, it's out into these suburban corridors. And the big numbers are those that get picked up in this map. So if that continues, we expand in these, basically these 5 places, 6 if you split up Casey and Cardinia on the southeast. But we expand through what was originally the 5-finger plan of Melbourne's development. I think you have to hold it that way and maybe break a thumb or something. But you would end up with expansion through Werribee, through Melton, through Craigieburn, through Whittlesea, and through Pakenham and Cranbourne on the edges of Melbourne. But the amount that we're growing at the moment isn't just about expansion. We're also densifying and reusing our existing city. About 20 years ago, almost no one lived in the CBD around us now. Now tens of thousands of people do. About 40,000 people live in the CBD of Melbourne. So it's a big change that we recognised, and it happened all around the world. People recognised that their inner cities provided vibrant, great places to live, and started reusing areas that have been emptying out over time. So in this square, roughly this square in the centre of Melbourne, over the last 10 years, the population density has gone from 3,300 people per square kilometre to 4,500 people per square kilometre. And the area hasn't changed. So the population density increase is really just the population increase if you don't change the area. But in Melbourne, the CBD, we went from 15,000 to 41,000 people, 170% increase. In Docklands, which you would expect it to happen in Docklands because it went from a place that wasn't residential at all at the docks to a place that is residential, nearly a 200% increase in the population and the density. And Brunswick East isn't all that inner a suburb. It's a few k's out. It's not the same as Docklands or Melbourne, but it also, by building a lot of apartments, has seen an increase of 50% in its population and its density. Now, on a world scale, they're not enormous densities. If you compare it to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Yorkville, which Wikipedia tells me it's Yorkville. I'm not that familiar with Manhattan. I know what people mean when they say the Upper East Side, but if you look at the building form that's there, that gets you about 42,000 people per square kilometre. So that's a bit more than double what we've currently got in the CBD of Melbourne, or 4 times what we see around us here in Carlton. The 11th arrondissement of Paris, similar, and Kowloon in Hong Kong, similar. So while we're densifying our cities, it's a long way before we look like some other world cities. But we're also doing it throughout the whole of Melbourne, particularly inner and middle suburbs. Bentley is where I grew up, and when I grew up there were single houses and some apartments and flats, and then there was a change through the 1990s, a bit of a redevelopment of the city, but that's the top half of the redevelopment of Bentley, is when there were small apartments moved in, 2 houses on a block where there used to be 1 house on a block. Excuse me. But now the new Bentley, that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years, is multiple apartment towers. Again, it's about these places being recognised as being very accessible to the city, very accessible to employment. People, again, are making those rational decisions. For the same money, you might get the 2-bedroom apartment in Bentley or a 3-bedroom house somewhere further out. But if what is more important to you is being closer to the services, closer to the city, then that's a rational choice you make. We expect in the future a lot more people to be trading place for space. You have the choice, perhaps for the same money, of a smaller dwelling or a larger dwelling, but if what is more important to you is the location and the function and the other services you have around you that are provided by the planners and service providers, then that's the rational choice you'll make. But it also happens on the outer fringes of the city as well, where we used to carve up the city, or the fringes of the city, into blocks of 800 square metres, roughly when I started looking at these things 15 years or so ago. Over time, that's been crunching down. Now the average block size you find on the fringes of the city is about 400 square metres. So often, if you go to expanding places, you will see that these blocks have house and not backyard, in the way that used to be house and big garden. Now you just see house to the fence line. But even that isn't as dense as things are going to get and are becoming on the fringes of the city. You know, the old Caroline Springs, as old as Caroline Springs gets, 15 years or so ago, large houses on reasonably small blocks. The new Caroline Springs is moving to townhouses and apartments. So even what we think of as the parts of the city where we can just expand forever and ever and build big houses are going to be used differently. As long as our population keeps growing so strongly, we have to find new ways to use our spaces and to accommodate people. But then there are other parts of the city, other parts of the state, where the story is a little bit different. I mentioned Ararat. Now, Merino is further to the west and the south of Ararat, but that's a place that in the past might have had a population of a few hundred. There were small farms around towns like this, and if you had a few hundred small farms, that could support a town with a few shopkeepers, a pub, a post office, all these sorts of things. But the nature of farming has changed. Farms aren't run by, or generally aren't run by one family on a small plot anymore. All of those hundreds of family farms might now be 2 farms, run by a dozen people each and a lot of laptops and automated machinery, something like that. So the ability to support that town, or the need for having that town, isn't there anymore. So Merino is now down to 9 or 10 people, where it might have had hundreds. And when we look at the migration patterns of places, we can see how this comes about. These charts show basically the difference that's happened in places over 5 years due to migration. Take out any difference that happens due to births and deaths. The City of Melbourne, it's all about young people moving in at the ages 15 to 29. The City of Melton, that fringe growth area, people moving in across all ages, but mostly those parent and child and new household ages. But the shires of West Wimmera and Yarriambiack, which have decreasing populations out in the far west of the state, places that used to support a lot of farms, now support fewer farms, smaller towns. There are people moving out of those areas in net terms. West Wimmera, lots of young people moving out, but also older people moving away from that shire, because when those bigger towns become smaller towns, they lose their services. If you're an older person living in a very small town and you need complex medical services, or you want to find a retirement home or a hostel that's suitable for your high care needs, you're not going to find it in a town of 9 or 10 people. Maybe not in a town of 900 people. You need to move up those sort of hierarchy of towns to a place where you can find the services you need. And that becomes a sort of snowballing effect of decreasing population. That if you don't have the population, you don't get the services built. If you don't have the services, people need to move somewhere else. But we're not alone in that. This is a map of Kansas in the US, which to me has the most fantastic statistical geography I've ever seen. It's like a Scrabble board. Nice, neat rectangles, none of our crazy borders about rivers and things, apart from in the northeast there. But wherever you see that sort of beige colour across Kansas, that's a loss of population. So it's only gain in population in the cities in the northeast and in a few of the larger and medium-sized towns dotted through the state. Most of those rural farming areas, places that raised corn, raised wheat, raised hogs, they've decreased their population as people have changed the way they do things and moved to larger cities. Now, I'm running out of time as I do because I love to prattle on about my stuff. But it might seem obvious, but everything does change over time. If we're planning, we must be planning for change. The population of Melbourne has more than doubled in the last 40 years, and we expect it to almost double again. The proportion who are in the older age groups has increased over time because we're living longer and because there was a big cohort of the population called the baby boomers who were born in the 50s and 60s and are now moving into the older ages. And our life expectancy has been increasing. If you were a male born in 1971, expect 68 years of life. Hang on. Is that males born in 71? I don't know if it is. Might be an average of all males alive in 71. But basically the story is that we're increasing the length of our lives over time. And we think about the way the city is used and the way the city's changed. A third of all our jobs in 1971 were in manufacturing. A few years ago, 1/7 of all our jobs were in manufacturing. In 2051, how many of us will be working in manufacturing? And even if we are, it'll be a vastly different kind of manufacturing. So that changes the way we need to move about the city, the places we need to go. We're not moving to suburban manufacturing plants for work. We're moving to perhaps inner suburban, high-tech, creative places for work. So it's a different city doing different things for different reasons. When we want to think about how we get to the future, we think about using projections, forecasts, scenarios of the future. A projection is, the way we see it, really numbers-based, taking some rates of what's been happening in the past, running those into the future. A forecast takes a bit more judgment, a bit more idea of what might change into the future, using a bit more nous and maybe some other indicators of what you know about the future to say that things will change. If you made a projection for one of those outer suburban areas, said it was going to grow by 2,000 people every year, that might be wrong because at some point you fill up all those paddocks and you stop growing. So the forecast takes a bit more information into it. And then scenarios are running a whole range of different assumptions about things. Are we going to grow fast, slow, in the inner suburbs, the outer suburbs, and seeing what that might mean for what you need to do differently in terms of policy or infrastructure or something like that. So you use scenarios to test what might happen in the future. In really simple terms, you can extrapolate something. You can take that rate or the amount of growth and assume that the same thing is going to happen every year. In really complex terms, you can try and use computer power to simulate every household or every person, and based on masses of big data, try and work out what decisions they're all going to make year on year. Are they going to have children? Are they going to move? Are they going to do something different? And then build all that up from the bottom to come up with a new picture. Sometimes you do the two things, you end up with the same, and you wonder why you spent all that time. But to do a micro-simulation of a population requires a whole heap of data. You can't do it for a small area, you can only do it for very big populations. But whichever method you're using, make sure it's a sound method. If you don't know, ask someone who knows, research, look up, find is this a sound method that's being used, or is it someone just plucking something out of the air? Ensure that the data that's gone into any projection or forecast is as current as possible. If you're using data from 10 years ago to try and understand what's going to happen in the near future, things have changed a lot since then. So make sure you're using the most up-to-date data you can. Make sure that the geography you're using matches your needs. If you only need to look at the whole of Australia, only look at the whole of Australia. But if you need to know about Melbourne rather than Sydney, then make sure you're looking at smaller area populations for those two places. Don't assume that the growth rate for Australia applies the same in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra or Merino. Make sure you're looking at the correct population. Do you want to know the daytime, nighttime population? Do you want to know the working population, the studying population? And generally, don't make things more complicated than you need to. If you need to look at one number, all you need to know is the population more likely to double next year than triple? Stay at that. But if you need to know, is it going to be 1.2% or 1.3%, then you might need to use more detail. When we do things for our projections, we look at that basic demographic equation. We put into something that's called a cohort component model that looks at all the different ages of the population and how likely they are to be born, to die, or to give birth, to die, to move in and out. And we get the results of that sort of demographic equation. That in 2011, 5.5 million people in the state, 1.8 million people added because there's more births and deaths. 2.8 million people added because more people move in than move out, gives you a population at 2051 of 10.1 million. It's a really, really big number. But when you look year by year at how those things happen, incrementally you change and you get to a big number in the future. You go further into the future, you get a bigger number. I won't show those details. When we're looking at smaller areas, really quickly, if we're looking at a town or a suburb of Melbourne, we don't have all the wealth of demographic information. We're not tracking people as they move across the borders in and out of Richmond. So we don't have that sort of migration stat. So we look at something else that can tell us a bit about what's going on there. And in particular, we look at residential development, where the dwellings are going to go. Extra people can go where extra dwellings go. If we weren't building extra dwellings on the fringes of the city, there wouldn't be people there. If we weren't building new apartments in the inner city, then there wouldn't be a population expansion in that inner city. But it's also very important to think about the way those places are occupied. I talked at the start about different sizes of households. If you build 1,000 houses on the fringe, they're generally going to be occupied at about 3 people per household. You're going to get 3,000 people. You build 1,000 apartments in the inner city, you might only get 1,000 people. So we think about all those nuances and working out where people are going to go, and we end up with a picture that tells us the strongest growth is on the outer edges of Melbourne, where we're building those new houses, and in the core of Melbourne, where we're building lots of new apartments. So we're about adding new places for people to live. That's where we get new people. When you look at the rest of the state, generally being closer to Melbourne or in a big regional centre means you will grow more. And that's that story of things concentrating even more into cities over time, because that's where our services and our jobs are. So very quickly, remember that there are risks, there is uncertainty. We can't eliminate risks. The future's always going to confound us, it's always going to throw things at us that we weren't expecting. But if we use our tools and our understanding as best as we can to give our clients, essentially, the most useful picture of the future they can have, then we're helping. We don't, some things are more certain than others. We know the population will grow in age. We don't know exactly how much. And skipping through all those things to the very top, another key point is, while we might know how many 60-year-olds there are going to be 20 years into the future, we don't know if they're going to behave like 60-year-olds today. Are they going to be healthier? Are they going to be working more or less? Those things are very important. Other way. Don't lose the story in the details. There's a whole range of scenarios of future growth out there, and they have very slightly different age structures in those future populations, but the big story is the population in the future will be heaps bigger. So don't get bogged down in the details at times. Policy is implicit in what we do. Remember that lots of people got it wrong. We know, as I said, that the future will confound us. The future will be different than we expect. Hopefully we won't get it as wrong as some of these people did. But always remember that if you're thinking about the future, all models are wrong, but some are useful. You're never going to, or you're very rarely going to predict the exact population in the future, but if you give people a useful understanding of what's changing, why it's changing, and why that's important for them to know, then you'll be useful to people in what you do. Go to the ABS website, quick ad, lots of cool data. I'm done, that's me. It's 9:58. Is there time for one question? Does anyone have one question? If not, then for the first time ever, I've finished on time. Cool. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Niz.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is very relevant to your understanding of urban agglomeration and infrastructure development, in particular in Victoria. Let's have a short break and we'll continue our discussion on infrastructure with a focus on transport. That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Now, I realise that you initially thought we might talk about Victoria, and now I'm realising now that most of the data I've got is for Sydney. But I think it's... yeah.
Thank you, mate. Thanks a lot.
See you next time.
Yeah, see you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just whether you want it. So this is the PowerPoint. They're
yeah.
the same one PDF.
And I'll upload. Can I upload this one for students? The PDF version?
Let me wait and see. I can't actually think because so as I'll explain, it's kind of a work in progress.
Oh, yeah.
So it might be better that I go back and clean it up before I do that.
Great.
Actually, I've got some notes. So, is it microphone here?
Yes. This is microphone.
And do I need it? I suppose I do.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is recording your voice.
Ah, okay.
It's the play.
Yeah.
Microphone. Thank you for your time and thank you for your offer.
Yeah.
Last year, the TED course gave a pretty good lecture, which is about education facilities. And we'll move on to the ideas about commuting and urban structure. And your lecture is very in right positions to link the infrastructure and urban spatial forms.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. So yeah, we're good. And is there a just use this all
Yeah.
to navigate?
Yeah.
Great.
The lecture finishes at 11, so as you said, like 45 minutes and discussion will be great.
Yeah. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
It may not. Yeah. I haven't actually run this through. I presented to our internal audience last week. We took an hour, but there was lots of engagement.
That's
So
great. Yeah.
perhaps with less engagement, it might be much less. But we'll just see. Yeah. Play it by ear.
Is your office just a Grattan Street?
Yeah, it is. It's on the other side, a little bit closer to Lygon Street. Yeah. So our facilities are provided by the University of Melbourne. So we have a very strong connection, obviously there.
Great. Okay, I'll give a short introduction.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, let's get started again. I'm very pleased to invite Hugh Betroni. He's working in Grattan Institute in a transport program, and he will talk about spatial structure of cities with a focus on transport infrastructure. Now we are moving from the infrastructure topic to broad spatial structure of cities, and next week we'll go through mid-range curve and urban spatial structure, and this lecture is in the right position to link the infrastructure issues to the urban scale. So I hope you can enjoy this lecture, and he'll talk more about Sydney, which is great, and let's warm welcome Hugh Betroni.
Thanks, everyone. So, yeah, it's a shame I missed David's presentation just before because I think what I'm about to take you through is it is a heap of ABS data. So there is some question about whether I'm doing it the way that he would recommend. And I guess part of what we're trying to do is draw policy implications out of all of the ABS population data. So what I have to present today is our forthcoming research that we're doing, so sort of ongoing research that will be a forthcoming report in probably sort of 2 or 3 months' time. So it's a partially formed research project. Very keen to get any feedback as we go, so please feel very free to interrupt with questions if you have any. And so that is that. I'll start by just sort of explaining who we are at the Grattan Institute. because that might be a little bit strange to some people as well. So we're an independent think tank, and we were established about 10 years ago with an endowment from both public and private sectors. We're dedicated to developing high quality public policy based on evidence, and we are also very intentionally practical in the advice that we try to give. So we sort of see our role in many ways straddling academia and public service and public policy advice. And it's also important for me to let you know that our independence is very important to us, and we don't take external money for specific research projects. So every research project we do is one that we think will make a contribution rather than one that somebody is paying us to do. So this is what I've got for today, which is what we're calling this report is the spatial structure of cities, which I'll start by explaining, and then I'll run you through the rest of the content of this slide. So jumping into it, this slide presents a range of visualizations of spatial structure. So when you look at a city visually, how does it look? And often, terms we hear about are monocentric cities, polycentric cities, and then what we see on this slide are three other potential models. So one is this mosaic of live-work communities, the fourth one along, which is where everyone is clustered into very small and relatively independent areas for living and working. And sorry, by spatial structure, I'm talking about the patterns of travel between homes and workplaces. So spatial structure you might be able to visualise it in a range of ways, but essentially we're talking about travel, and for purposes of this report, we're talking about travel between homes and workplaces. So commuting is what we're looking at. And so these archetypal spatial structures are some of the things that we will try and take a look at along the way. So the first task that I have is to convince you about why we care about spatial structure, and perhaps to begin with, why Grattan Institute is even interested in this topic to begin with. So the first is that, as David, I imagine, talked you through, the 2016 census, results of which were released last year, contains a heap of information about travel patterns. So very big data sets that kind of take a lot of time to sift through, and part of what we do is look at a lot of data, and so we're well placed to do that. The second reason why that we're interested in doing this topic is that Australia's cities, and in particular Melbourne and Sydney, but all of our cities are growing very quickly. And there's also a very strong sense that our transport networks are not working as well as they could. And then thirdly is our third reason for wanting to pursue this research is that we think that spatial structure, so the patterns of commuting, they matter a great deal, and for three reasons. And these three reasons are the subject of the next few slides. So firstly, they are a very important determinant of how productive a city is. Secondly, it can help us prioritise infrastructure investment. And third, it can also help us tell us about other urban policies that people might want to pursue, or governments might want to pursue in terms of moving employment out to non-CBD employment centres, and also the way that we apply zoning and planning regulations. So this is one reason why spatial structure matters, and that is that spatial structure can tell us how integrated a labour market is, and how integrated a labour market is, and this is kind of our claim, is a key determinant of productivity. So, the Ed Glazer quote, I'm not sure if you've come across him at all in the course of this subject, but he's sort of one of the eminent names in transport economics, urban economics, and his view is, and this kind of stretches back to sort of Adam Smith times, is that cities function because of the division of labour that's possible in them. Cities are density, their proximity and closeness. And so when we talk about the benefits of proximity, we're talking often economists will couch that in terms of agglomeration impacts and agglomeration benefits. And a big part of that agglomeration is the sort of people coming together, and a big part of that is the labour market effects. So when cities arise because of these forces, and the main force is labour market pooling in terms of the number of jobs that I, as a worker, have access to, and the number of employees that a firm has access to. And so the cities, big cities, are more productive places than smaller cities, and that's what this chart is trying to get a sense of. So I don't know how clearly it's visible. It's plotting real GDP per capita for American cities against the size of a population, the size of a city in terms of its population. And obviously there are many causal factors in per capita income. But what this is showing is that bigger cities are more productive. Bigger cities have higher income per person. And our claim is that one of the key reasons for that is the extent of labour market integration. So the number of jobs that people can get access to and the number of workers that firms can get access to within reasonable amounts of time. And so the other claim that we are kind of pursuing in the course of doing this work is that it's the actual number of jobs that people have access to rather than the potential number of jobs that people have access to that is the key way for understanding the size of a metropolitan labour market. And by that, I mean that a lot of past research has presented charts like these, and these are in fact Grattan Institute charts of about 5 years ago, where we looked at the number of jobs that can be reached within a 45-minute car journey. And we did the same for public transport as well. And so you've got Melbourne on the left and Sydney on the right. And so you see that those areas with the very light coloured shading have access to very few, less than 10% of jobs within a 45-minute car trip. And so this was the way it was presented in the past to say, oh, well, is this a potential policy shortcoming that such a large part of a metropolitan region has access to so few jobs. And so this is what we mean by potential access to jobs. What we're doing with this report is turning this on its head in some ways to say it's not so much a problem, or necessarily a problem for those 10% of people for those people living in light shaded areas where you might have access within a reasonable amount of time to only 10, 20, 30% of the city's jobs. What matters is how many people actually get to their jobs within a certain amount of time. And so this chart, again, sorry, it's fairly noisy, and I think we will, by the time we're done with it, find a better way to present it. But what we're saying here is that on the left-hand side, the number of people, the percentage of a city's population that actually get to their work within 15 minutes in each of these 6 different cities. And so you see that for Sydney, that's around 25%, and Canberra, that's around 30% off those charts. And then moving across, say, to the sort of the fourth bundle where we've got less than 60 minutes, you see a slightly wider divergence where in fact, I'm going to struggle to read that from here. I almost should have printed the numbers. But it's around 70 to 75% of people that live in Sydney get to their jobs within 60 minutes, compared to in Canberra, where you have more than 90% of people getting to their jobs within 60 minutes. And so this is one of the main areas that we're trying to focus on for our research, is the actual number of people who've reached their jobs within a certain amount of time rather than the potential access. And we do that because cities are dynamic. People move house, employers move location as well. And so just because for those people that live out in these lightly shaded areas, if they can't get to, a certain number of the city's jobs within a reasonable amount of time, it perhaps isn't that insightful, because some of them may have chosen to move there for a specific reason. Perhaps they're out of the labour force at that point, retired or something like that, or perhaps they are in stable employment in one of those areas. And as we'll look at later, the dispersion of jobs throughout a city is not such that all the jobs are in one central location, but we'll come to that. Trying to see where I can see the time, Min. Sorry, I don't have a watch with me, just to make sure I'm not.
You can.
Beautiful. All right, I think we're tracking well. So this second reason, in addition to its labour market impacts, the second reason why we care about the spatial structure of a city is that it can help prioritise investments in infrastructure. So I understand that you have looked in recent weeks at infrastructure investment and cost-benefit analysis that's done to inform where the biggest bang for the buck is in terms of investments in transport infrastructure, for example. So this is not a claim that spatial structure will tell you exactly what investments work, but it's the claim that what it will do is it will give you an initial read on what given the spatial structure, what projects would we suggest might work and what may not. So, for example, in cities that have a very dense urban core, then that might be a place where fixed heavy rail might be one of the solutions. But in other places, and Canberra I think is a good example of this, and I'll explain the chart in a second, but for a place like Canberra where employment is highly dispersed and people tend to travel by car and people also tend to reach their jobs within very reasonable amounts of time, then that suggests that possibly fixed heavy rail, or with a very high likelihood, a fixed heavy rail line might not be the solution that you would try and pursue for a place like that. And so it is interesting, therefore, that Canberra, which is now in the process of building a light rail line, undertook the cost-benefit analysis for that a couple of years ago, and it was very, very kind of difficult to argue on economic grounds that it stacked up. So, and I think this spatial structure can help to give us a bit of a sense of why that might be the case. And sorry, this chart that you're looking at there is a random sample of 200 journeys to work in Canberra. And so what we're trying to present here is not some definitive answer or definitive perspective on what a spatial structure is, but it just gives a sense that this random sample shows that people are kind of travelling from everywhere to everywhere, and there doesn't seem to be a very strong monocentric nature to the city. And then the third reason that we care, or we think we should care about spatial structure, is that it can help inform us of the merits of other urban policies. And so these are claims that get made from time to time, or in fact quite recently in the case of Sydney, which we'll look at in more detail in a second. And this is work by the Greater Sydney Commission, which has developed this plan for Sydney to be comprised of 3 individual cities within a larger metropolis. And I don't know whether you've come across that, but the proposal is that you have sort of the harbour city in the east. You have I think they call it the river city around Parramatta, and then you have what they're calling the parkland city in the outer west around the Badgerys Creek airport, which they're about to start building. And so spatial structure in terms of how people travel to and from work might help tell us about whether that's a good idea. It can also help tell us about these idea of 20 or 30 minute cities, which is also very much a popular concept. And in this way, we can look at things like Parramatta, the claim of Parramatta to be Sydney's second CBD, and the idea that in Parramatta in 2011 it had 2% of Sydney's employment. 2016 it basically had the same share of Sydney's popular employment, and so there is kind of a question there about whether or how you get a place like Parramatta to actually ever become the second CBD, or the extent to which it's actually even feasible that be, or a sensible policy for people to pursue. So here are the key questions that we are looking at, and these are probably fairly obvious by now, but the first is how governments perceive and project the spatial structure of their cities. The second is exactly how we should characterise different cities in Australia and their spatial structure. So I'll take you through the data for Sydney in a second. We're hoping to run that for a range of cities of different sizes in Australia, certainly the 6 cities that were presented earlier. A look at how it's changed over time, so that Parramatta example, to see exactly where people are starting to travel to more for work or where they're not. And then, the last two are about, the fourth one is about how new residents, particularly immigrants to a city, how their spatial structure might look compared to existing populations, which also might help us in the planning for future infrastructure needs, and also how adaptable we think people are. So here is our presentation of Sydney's spatial structure. Again, this is a random sample of 200 journeys to work using the 2016 census. And so while there is obviously a clustering in the city, this random sample of 200 journeys does show much more of a constrained dispersion type of model. If we go back right up to these initial models, so that constrained dispersion on the left, rather than having a really strong monocentric, polycentric kind of feel, even potentially a bit more, very much, sorry, I would say a bit more disordered than that. So the next slide that I have here looks at the jobs, the number of jobs that are in Sydney CBD. So if we define Sydney CBD quite generously, not just the CBD core, but extending it to suburbs like Surrey Hills and Pyrmont, then that's where you find about almost 20%, but it's really about 19% of Sydney's jobs. And this chart here shows you exactly where people are coming from as the crow flies to get to those places. And as you can see, the yellow lines, which are those trips less frequently made, are from further away, but it does seem to be fairly broad spread across the city. This chart here looks at Sydney's polycentres, so those areas that are designated in planning documents as being the places where Sydney, they're trying to grow jobs. And so that captures, that represents about 14% of Sydney's journeys to work. So in this case, most of these jobs are done, most of these trips are done by car. And then finally, this is around 70% of journeys to work in Sydney, which are much more randomly allocated across the city. And so these are not jobs in employment centres. These are sort of your perhaps education jobs, healthcare jobs, personal care kind of jobs that are kind of everywhere. And I think this, in a lot of ways, is for a lot of people, is an unexpected finding that so much of the employment is not kind of clustered into some sort of employment centre, whether it be the CBD or a Parramatta or somewhere like that, that most of the city's jobs, or most of Sydney's jobs, are scattered around like they are. And you also see here that travel to and from these much more random jobs is done from kind of a bit more all over the place. So how has these patterns of travel changed over the years? So I think, the story here is that distance to work haven't changed very much over the past 5 years, or the 5 years from 2011 to 16. So in 2011, the average distance to work for Sydney-siders was 7.5 kilometres. In 2016, it was trending up towards 8, but a difference there of 200 metres. So people are adapting. So we have seen a lot of population growth in that period of time. So I know that Sydney grew around 20% over the 10-year period from 2006 to 16. So making the assumption that the city grew by 10% between 11 and 16 which is a bit of a kind of back of the envelope guess, it is interesting that in that period of time, population grows by 10%, and at the median, distance to employment changes by 200 metres. And for many other areas, doesn't change much as well. Doesn't change much at all. Many other parts of the distribution. And here we present this is again the same kind of thing. So we look at 2004 to 2016, and the horizontal axis here presents the distribution. So 0.5 is the median traveller, and their journey to work was 30 minutes in 2004, and that same median traveller in 2016 had the same trip time. And so obviously over that period of time, Sydney has grown enormously. Constraints on the transport network have also apparently grown a lot as well, if you, or certainly anecdotally. But over that period of time, the cities adapt in such a way that people are still travelling around 30 minutes at the median. And obviously there's a bit more movement at the 90th percentile, so for 10% of workers, things do seem to have gotten a little bit worse over that period of 2004 to 2016. But for the overwhelmingly for most people, so for roughly 3/4 of people living in Sydney, their journeys to work haven't actually changed in that period of time, which is quite interesting. And so this is the phenomenon which you may have come across, called Marchetti's constant, which is actually kind of I think Marchetti was a physicist, and this was I can't actually remember how he arrived at it, but he looked at sort of this journey to work and commuting time kind of since ancient times through to today, and found this kind of fairly stable relationship where people were prepared, or people did reveal that they would travel around 30 minutes to work as an average. And so it is interesting to see that still seems to be the case, with obviously some variation at different parts of the distribution, but that as an average, that's kind of a fascinating thing that it continues to hold. So which areas are growing and which areas everywhere is growing. Which areas are growing more quickly and which areas are not, is the purpose of this slide. So the top Sydney, Haymarket, the Rocks is what you would think of as the real urban core. Its employment share is growing enormously. So it's grown by 27% over that 5-year period, and that's at the top. That's towards the top of anywhere of these suburbs presented. But then we also see that there are a bunch of areas that are not the CBD that have grown enormously over that period of time as well. And some of them are places, I think, halfway down you see Balcombe Hills, Bella Vista, and I think that's, an example of somewhere where growing off a relatively low base might explain it. So Liverpool is kind of the same as well. But other areas are also a bit more established and growing very fast. So Macquarie Park would be one of those non-CBD employment places. And then also you see very strong growth in those areas around the CBD as well, which would include Pyrmont, Ultimo at around 25%. And that Parramatta result is also kind of an interesting one, where it's grown much more slowly than a lot of other employment hubs throughout the city. So there is a big question there about its role as a second CBD, I think, or how that can actually happen. Clearly there is some constraint there. This slide presents work that was done by PwC, not by us, but it looks at the centre of gravity, what's called the centre of gravity it presents in those three markers on the map, which are not very clear: the economic, the employment, and the residential centre of gravity, which are obviously a fair distance west, or sort of northwest of the CBD. And interestingly, in Sydney, those are continuing to drift westward, which is not the case in other cities, other cities in Australia, according to PwC, where the centre of gravity, so geographically where most of the employment activity or economic activity is taking place. In every other city other than Sydney, that is moving more towards the CBD. In Sydney, it isn't. There is a question there about whether that's Sydney's geography that's sort of pushing it west, because Sydney is, in some senses, a bit more constrained to the east than other cities, certainly compared to Melbourne, which can kind of grow out in all directions. But that is interesting, I think, that most of the activity is moving away. So here we have we show the spatial structure and a visual representation of spatial structure for immigrants, so new arrivals, and you do see quite a distinct difference, I think, between first-year immigrants and existing population. So this excludes students, but it does show that there is much more of a monocentric feel for first-year immigrants. So this is hopefully helpful ways for urban planners and transport planners to think about the needs and the growth areas and where they need to provide new infrastructure. So you see this, much more monocentric kind of feel. And even this is 5 years on the left-hand side compared to existing population. So you do see it starting to look a lot more like the existing population, but continuing to still be much more monocentric in nature. And so this presents the employment shares. So compared to the population as a whole, 30% of first-year immigrants will go and work in the city, compared to around 19%. Sorry, actually, it's around 14% for just that individual suburb. It was 19% for a broader CBD. For the smaller CBD, it's around 14%. And then that obviously moves over time, but even 10 years afterwards is still a higher share of immigrants that are 10 years on working in the CBD. So I have raced through that, in fact. Looking at the time, I think we're well ahead. I've got a couple of sort of concluding slides where we're kind of at the point of trying to draw out policy implications. These are not hugely kind of definitive in any way, but I'll run them through you. So obviously, as I mentioned, we think Sydney does seem to exhibit much more of a constrained dispersion model rather than a monocentric model, and that's important for reasons like infrastructure provision and where you focus, the provision of infrastructure, and also how you might be able to get more labour market integration over time. We also see that polycentric growth hasn't really taken off in a huge way. So Sydney's polycentres kind of had 14% of Sydney's jobs 5 years ago, continue to have 14% today. And so the question there is about what are the barriers to getting places like Parramatta or Macquarie Park or in Melbourne, assuming it's the same story, which I think it is, places like Monash to grow and to take a much larger share of employment. So presumably in that, transport infrastructure is one of the key barriers, but presumably also planning plays a role as well. So in Sydney, and indeed in Melbourne too, anywhere that isn't the CBD that tends to only have, if it does at all, have one fixed rail line that connects it, versus, compared to the CBD, which is, because we've got a radial network, all the rail lines coming into an urban core. And so in a place like Parramatta with sort of one fixed rail stop for people to get on and off at, and then otherwise relying on bus transport, which obviously shares the road with all the other cars and sits in traffic, it's probably very difficult to ask to get that to become a more appealing place for people to try and get to. So we also see, I don't think we presented much on this. We may have something on it. anyhow, CBDs are becoming more dense. In fact, we have seen CBD growing. We're also seeing them expand as well. We're seeing people adapt, and I think that's a really kind of encouraging sign that it's not all doom and gloom, that people do find ways to make their commutes manageable. And jumping ahead to some other policy implications, there is this question about prioritising infrastructure, and perhaps you covered this in recent weeks, but I guess our view would be that urban planning should follow people and not vice versa. So most people are commuting to everywhere. Most people are not commuting into one specific place. So while there is people will make arguments about you can build a rail line and then things will magically happen, I think you have to remember that a lot of the jobs growth is in sectors that are not these kind of agglomeration benefiting jobs. So they're what you might instead call population jobs in healthcare and education, in personal care, for example. And so your solutions to help people to get there will be different compared to if you think that most jobs are starting to be in places that are sub-centres. So one of the other takeaways is that efficient urban rail infrastructure requires dense cities that have very highly concentrated CBDs. So clearly that is the case to a large extent in somewhere like Sydney. Probably it's much less so in a city like Canberra or other smaller cities. So in places like that, while you can look at the economics of it, it's potentially not the place to start. Importantly, building on the idea that most people commute to everywhere, is the idea that cars are still the way we do that, and the automobile still remains the most important means of integrating labour markets. And a lot of our productivity, the labour market productivity of our cities does rely on a car. So while that's kind of may feel in a lot of ways like sort of something of an old-fashioned concept that the car is king, and clearly it's true that cars impose a lot of external costs, so in the way that they cause pollution, they cause accidents, they cause traffic congestion, and we do want to think about ways to solve for some of those problems, for all of those problems indeed. They are still very important for Australian cities and for Australian labour markets, and so that we very much need to keep that in mind and not think that the entirety of the solution is in public transport, because then you will be ignoring the vast majority of jobs and the way that people get to those jobs. The second last point there deals with the idea that we want our cities to be as flexible as possible, because flexibility is what helps labour markets adapt and be and to be integrated. And so, while we haven't looked at the exact magnitude of the problems or the barriers involved in it, you would certainly think that policies like stamp duties that slow down the rate at which people will move house are an impediment, and that to the extent that you see adaptation being slower in some cities compared to others, then stamp duties is potentially one place to look for a solution. And yeah, the final slide is very much a summing up of kind of everything on these last two slides and throughout. So the overall policies that we want to promote are ones that promote regional connectivity or connectivity throughout an entire metropolitan region. They are policies that allow for speedier rather than slower commuting. And they are ones that allow for more rather than less commuting. So in that way, 20-minute cities may be not the goal, rather than giving people the opportunity to get as far as possible within a reasonable amount of time, and potentially for longer rather than shorter commuting as well, to take advantage of metropolitan-wide economic opportunities. So that is, I think, all I had. Very happy to take questions. Very keen to take questions. In fact, if you have any comments to make, because as I said, we're kind of in the process of writing this up and extending it to other cities, including Melbourne. at some point over the next couple of months and then releasing it. So yeah, that's really it. Thanks very much. And yeah, please ask questions if you have any.
Any questions?
So you were showing that most immigrants workers travel more to CBD, but that would be probably due to the immigration program attracting more white-collar workers instead of tradespeople
Yeah.
that aren't really CBD based. So is there any way to take that into account and try and find?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't know whether this is at all an answer, but perhaps it's kind of that if your immigration program changed and you took less, what do they call the highly skilled immigrants, supposedly highly skilled immigrants, and you did take more blue collar workers, then you would be planning for a different type of spatial structure. So I think that's probably right. It's also true though that immigrants, I think, regardless, although I think because we do have mostly white collar ones, regardless, they do take public transport much more than they'll drive. So I think even if you did have more blue collar workers, you probably still have a reliance on public transport, and I think that's also very important to know for planning purposes too. Yeah, does that kind of, I don't know, that's a thought, yeah. And if there isn't anything else, yeah.
I do like the sentence and urban planning to follow people, not networks. And I just want to ask, and maybe the boundary of the choices of people, because for me, I actually was a victim of the Melbourne public transport, just like trains, and maybe it do have a lot of problems. Just during the rush hours, we can't get every chance because there's too much people, too much passengers. And I really want to know how is the culture or boundary of the people's resilience that the government would care more about that. Maybe try to just figure out these problems or try to solve them.
Yeah. So that's a question about planning for growth, is it? So if you have a lot of population growth and places pressure on your ability to catch a train or a tram at a different time of day, I wonder whether that's. Tell me if I've misheard your question. Is it simply that we haven't done a good enough job of simply planning for growth rather than where it needs to be? We do know that if population is growing by a certain amount in a certain area, like where we are here, that instead of having 10 trams an hour, you actually that needs to grow by 5 or 10% a year. And if it's not doing that, then you are going to have very heavy constraints on people's ability to get around. So I just wonder whether is it a question more around what David presumably was talking about, where the trend looks like this, therefore public transport supply, the number of services we put on needs to match that?
Yes, maybe similarly, I just want how should the government solve this effect or problems according to our planners, maybe on which boundaries we need to care about, maybe it's really influence the social orders because the heavy traffic jams, or maybe it's not quite convenient for the passengers. And I do think this is, as you said, we need to consider about.
Sorry, say that last bit. What did you say?
Maybe actually is a popular the population growth and how does the government or our planners should take more care of maybe how they complain or just maybe 5% we need to concern about, but actually it came to 10% just to influence the ordinary order of the public transport we need to consider. And I do want to know which is the boundary of that, or just if someone complains that the government need to pay attention on it.
Oh, so how it actually happens in practice? Yeah, I'm not sure I understand. Can anyone else help me understand the question?
Maybe if just if the population grows every year,
Yes.
and it actually causes a lot of problems, and maybe and actually I want to ask how these problems can be solved, or how these problems can be seen, or can be adapted, can be seen, or can be more attention to the government.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I think you got it. So it's how how we build enough infrastructure for the population that we have growing. And I think so. Partly it is. Yeah. You do need to build a lot of infrastructure to keep up with population growth, and I think that's been one of the problems certainly in Victoria, well, Melbourne and Sydney, because we've had huge amounts of population growth, and then a long period of time where we weren't building enough new infrastructure. So until the last couple of years, we probably hadn't built enough. We hadn't invested in enough new infrastructure, and we're now starting to get underway with it, with probably an investment program that should have started 10 years ago. And so you almost get two effects there: one, that you don't have enough infrastructure to begin with, and two, in the process of building a lot of big new infrastructure, you disrupt your transport networks at the moment in order to build them, like out here on Grattan Street, for example. And so you have those two things happen at the same time, and it becomes very hard. So I think it probably is a failure of governments to plan properly or to invest at the right kind of rate. I mean, perhaps it's also population growth, like David said at the end, is very hard to predict. And they were caught out without knowing how fast population would grow, but at the same time, probably they haven't done enough until now to keep up with it. Yeah. Hey.
I think just a comment. I've noticed that when you studied Sydney, there was quite a lot of focus on infrastructure. But I was actually just recently at Sydney, and I realized, honestly, I wouldn't want to work in the CBD compared to Melbourne.
Yeah.
Because it seemed that the planning was more haphazard in terms of height limits, or even the narrowness of the streets.
Yes.
Possibly it would be meaningful and interesting to also look at the planning policies for the environment, not just purely infrastructure.
Yeah, okay. That's in the CBD where you were?
Yeah, and when I went out to Barangaroo, it was a lot more appealing to work there. So maybe that's why in Sydney they're not seeing that monocentric spatial structure.
Yeah, good.
And
Interesting.
a lot of people rather work outside in Barangaroo or Parramatta or Macquarie Park.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the CBD was really haphazard compared to Melbourne, where I think there's more planning control.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, you certainly, you saw that the growth in places around the CBD was happening a lot. Well, it was happening at a very large extent. The CBD is still growing a lot too, but places like Surrey Hills, and a lot of that is cheaper rents that businesses get from moving out there, but part of it is also probably that combination of amenity and the cost.
Like Barangaroo, there's Darling Harbour, so you can have drinks, and it's just next to the bay.
Yeah, it's nice.
It's more appealing.
Yeah. Thanks. Hi.
Can I just get a point of clarification? I'm just reading the last page of notes.
Hi.
How you seem to be advocating against a 20-minute neighbourhood.
Yeah.
So we've been doing some reading about how the board of works had district centre plans in the 80s, and it focused more on a prohibited model of zoning rather than a incentivised model of zoning to try and get people into, I think about 13 or 15 centres. And we've got the same plan now with Plan Melbourne. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in Sydney, but are you saying that it's not working, that we should get to a more laissez-faire, flexible model? Get away from those fixed zones, not even conglomerate around those things.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether I'm saying something as prescriptive as that, but I think it's probably true that the combination of transport infrastructure constraints plus planning constraints is what holds a lot of these places back. So I'm not saying that you definitely want more laissez-faire, and it may be one much more than the other. So it may be in a place like Parramatta that its constraint on ever having more than 2% of Sydney's jobs is that you can't build, they can't build enough big buildings in certain places, or they get held up for such a long period of time that doesn't happen. That might be part of it. I think probably I do lean more towards the constraint being transport infrastructure. So the fact that it's on one rail line, probably the better example is here at Monash, which is the same, hasn't grown its share of Melbourne's jobs over a period of time. It doesn't actually have a train station. It's got a nearby train station. It relies on cars. You reach a certain point where there's so much congestion that your most flexible way of getting people into those places is by bus, and buses share the road, so it doesn't work very well. So I think, and so that's one reason to be sceptical about getting these places to work, and then to be the heartbeat of a 20-minute city, for example. But then the other concern is that if you focus on delivering 20-minute cities, are you then missing the essential, what is essential about a city, which is where people have access to this huge pool of jobs, and that the beauty of it is that you can travel ideally at speed, whether it's using urban freeways or fast fixed rail lines. You can travel from one place to somewhere that might be an hour away or 45 minutes away, so much bigger than a 20-minute city. And that is the labour productivity benefits of doing that are really are worth paying attention to. And so if you're just doing a more insular thing, it's very complicated, because obviously if you do the more insular 20-minute city thing, maybe people's welfare goes up, because outside of economics and labour productivity, there are all these other reasons for people to get benefits from being able to walk to work, and having fewer cars around and things like that. So it's, I don't think I've got a perfect solution for it, but I think on balance I'm sceptical of 20-minute cities as a policy goal.
What you describe as if there is a large level of elasticity with people's tolerances of travelling distances, for example. You mentioned the movement in the 90th percentile. How's that sort of changing over time as you see it? I mean, it's housing affordability is the main driver for people. You see that just moving up incrementally and just indefinitely.
Yeah. So that is one, and I'll talk to that, but I may not have captured it right. But housing affordability wise, you would have reason to be concerned about a chart like this if all of the affordable housing is in those less than 10% areas, those very lightly shaded areas, and young people in particular, are forced to go out there, and therefore their access to jobs within a certain amount of time is probably likely to be less. So I don't think we have a good sense of that. I suspect a lot of the cheap housing is probably out in those areas, but there's probably also a lot of cheap housing that is further in. It's smaller or something, for example. The one concept that I didn't talk about, which kind of pervades all of this stuff, is called, and you've probably come across it, is, I've now gone over time. I feel like I might have, but it's this concept of spatial equilibrium. So Sydney and Melbourne have become really popular places for people to move to, and that's people coming there is governed by this spatial equilibrium concept, where people will come there on the basis of the two components of a spatial equilibrium, which are income and amenity. And so you might move to Melbourne because you can get a higher paying job, but you also factor in, and if you're moving from a regional town, then perhaps your amenities, so your ability to walk to work, your ability to live in a kind of more pristine environment, you take a hit on that front, but you get higher income. And so what pushes people from a place to a place is that income and their amenity, and that governs housing affordability as well. Housing affordability is kind of, on the income side, you might think of it as your wage less your housing costs. And then on the amenity side, you might think about, well, now I have to live an hour away from work, and does that make things work for me or not? So I have gone over. I have gone over. So apologies for that. If you do, this is partially formed research. If you do come back to this at any point throughout this course, and I will send these slides to Min to circulate, my email address is there. Please get in touch and ask questions or anything you like. So thanks very much for listening, sitting through it, and yeah. Cheers.
Great. You have a tutorial with a focus on a case study report, and you have the reading, which is about smart growth or growth management, which includes the topic about infrastructure, financing, and urban form issues, so which is relevant to the topic discussed today. And next we'll move on to the topic about spatial structure. We'll address some issues from this topic, which is travel patterns and bid rent curve, which is related to housing prices and rent prices. See you next week.
Great. Thanks.
Oh yeah, thanks a lot.
No, that was
Yeah.
great. There's some good thoughts and good opportunity for us to socialise and
Yeah, it was an interesting project. So my understanding is that you analyze the travel patterns like Johnny Pro and to see where is the key corridors in terms of commuting. And my impression is that joint work data might have some causality issues. Because people chose some area because there is already good transport network. So if this research shows that these corridors need more infrastructure investment, it might relate to some issues because there are already good infrastructure. So people chose that area. And the commuting pattern is very obvious along the existing infrastructure.
yeah. It's a good thought. I'll give it some thought. I'll send you these slides once I've cleaned them up. I'll make sure that we have
Okay, you look great. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have a class? Do you
No,
want
it's
to
a
check it
check
out?
thing.
It takes ages to turn it on.
On the Windows?
I can turn on only Windows.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's a problem, so we're looking into all that kind of stuff.
That's good.